Welcome everyone to the third in our series of Food Safety for Food Entrepreneurs webinars. And today's webinar is about labeling basics. And this is part of the North Central Food Safety Extension Network project activities. So the next slide tells you a little bit about the North Central Food Safety Extension Network. We have been in operation since 2016. And you can certainly Google NCFSN or use the link that's shown, or you can go ahead and scan. We have a lot of information and we keep adding more. I just added 3 new fact sheets. Next slide. We also have fact sheets that are on the Iowa State University Extension store. And there's a link, and I bet Shannon will put it in the chat as well. And this was all made possible by a USDA NIFA grant. So we thank them for making this possible. Next slide. So these are some instructions you probably all know well. In fact, we're going to start by having you open the chat. So open the chat and tell us your city and state where you are right now. So where is everyone? Very good. Several Midwestern states. If you want to ask questions, there's a Q&A, so you can pose your question in that Q&A area. All right, and oh wow, so we have Florida. We're all over the place. Next slide, please. So again, just click on the Q&A icon to submit a question. Unfortunately, and I'll introduce myself in a minute, I do have to leave right after I'm done with my part. So I'll be leaving the questions to Karen, but I'll provide you with my email link. Next slide. I am Julie Garden Robinson. I am a food and nutrition specialist and professor at North Dakota State University. I'm located in Fargo. And our other speaker, the second speaker, will be Karen Blakesley, and she's from Kansas State University. And you have our direct contact as well as our emails, so I'm sure we'd welcome any questions that you have. For me, I have to leave for Chicago at promptly 12:30 today. I have to leave for the airport, so I do have to leave after I'm done, but I certainly welcome you to ask me questions by email or call me up. Next slide. So let's start with some food labeling basics. Just so you know what my job entails, lots of different things, but I do work with food entrepreneurs and existing food businesses. And they often have asked me questions about what has to be on my label. Well, we know that presentation counts. We want it to look good, but it's really a legal document. So you have to be very cautious about what you do put on your product label. So next. So I'd like you to go back to the chat. I know you know where it all is, where it is. Question 1, I'd like you to list some requirements that have to be on a commercial food product label. So just go ahead and text us what you're thinking, so we know what you already know. Okay, I'm seeing barcode, ingredients, allergen, nutrition, country of origin, use by date. All right. Second question. Now let's say you're a cottage food producer. Now I'd like you to list what are the requirements if you have a cottage food product or a product that you could make in a non-commercial kitchen. In our state, you could make it in your own kitchen. What has to be on the label? Thanks for your participation. Now we're going to go back through and talk through some of these things and find out what the FDA says about what has to be on a food label. So for those of you who listed the identity of the food, like what is the food? Is it macaroni? What is it? Is it pasta? What is it? What is the name of your company? I saw that listed. Your place, where did you make it? The ingredients, I saw that listed, and the net quantity. I also saw a few things like barcode and nutrition labels and some other things. Those technically are not required by law on commercial products. The people you sell it to, your retailer, might demand that you put those things on, but according to the food labeling guide, and there's a very detailed piece that you can download from the FDA site, and that includes lots of pictures and lots of information about food labeling. So if you don't have that downloaded onto your computer, if you get these kinds of questions, I'd highly recommend it. How about cottage foods? These are technically not inspected foods. The big thing here, it depends on your state. I've listed what has to be on a food product for cottage foods in my state of North Dakota. Basically, you just have to let them know it was made in a non-commercial kitchen. It's not inspected by the state or local health department. This will vary again depending on your state. And we actually put together a cottage food best practices guide. If you go to that NCFSN website, you can check that out. It's not necessarily all the legal things, but it's what we think are best practices. And I'm a nutritionist as well, and I always think you should have any allergens listed. But technically, some states only say that you have to let them know it was made in an uninspected kitchen. Next slide. I also saw some of you post that nutrition labeling has to be on the label on your food product. That isn't necessarily the case. It kind of, again, depends on if you're selling your product to a grocery store. They might say you have to have a nutrition label, but I'll show you some exceptions. One thing I want to make sure that everybody is fully aware that all of the nutrition labels on anything you buy in the grocery store had to be in compliance with the new food labeling laws. And that was January 1st of 2021. I still see some state-made products that are carrying old labels, and I'll talk through a little bit of the differences. But in the chat, what's the first thing you notice if you compare the original label and the new label? What pops out at you? Yes, calories, exactly. And they did that for a reason. They want people to know how much food energy they're taking in. Nutrition labels are intended to help us select a healthful diet. And part of that is knowing how much food value you're taking in based on the calories. You'll also notice probably that the serving size is now in a bigger font. Yes, right there. In fact, they've made the serving sizes more realistic to what people eat. So the old size for the serving for ice cream was a half a cup and is now 2/3 of a cup. Of course, that's going to change all the calories, fat, carbohydrates, everything else along with it. But if you are creating your own product or working with people who are creating products, be sure to check what the standard serving sizes are now. And again, you can find that on the Food and Drug Administration website. What else has to be on the new label? Vitamin D is a new addition, and potassium. And if we go up a bit, thank you for the cursor, Karen, added sugars. So we've had total sugars, but now we have added sugars. And I just did a session on this a couple of weeks ago, and it's still a confusing thing to people. So total sugars includes what you add, like table sugar, but it also can include natural sugars. So if you had chocolate milk, for example, that would have some added sugars, but it would also have some natural sugar, which is part of total sugar. So this is to help us consume less added sugar. So we can now compare one product to another, such as cereals, sweetened cereals and sweetened beverages and those sorts of things. So it's done for a reason. All of us are advised to probably eat less sugar than we currently do for a lot of different reasons. Vitamin D is not found in a lot of foods. It's found in some foods. It can be fortified, but especially those of us who live in the Midwest, I'd probably advise all of us to be taking vitamin D3 because we're going to move into a time of year where we don't get enough sun. So we aren't making vitamin D through the action of sun on our skin. So check out the vitamin D level. Potassium is also added, and that's because of its connection to heart health and a lot of other health, potential chronic diseases. So those are the new ones. They took out the requirement for listing vitamins A and C. Do we no longer need vitamins A and C? Yes, we still need them, but there was more of a tendency for people to be low in vitamin D and potassium. So they didn't want to make this a super long label, so they just made those two new ones and left out the old ones. But yes, indeed, you still need vitamins A and C. So next slide. So what nutrition claims or declarations can you put on a label? Well, again, as I said at the start, this is really a legal document, and health and nutrient content claims have to meet the FDA designations. And there's a long list of those designations, and they're based on the nutrition in a serving. So if you see low fat on a product, that means it contains 3 grams or less fat per serving. If it says reduced, you have to have an original because this new one that's reduced has to have 25% less than the original formulation. And fat-free isn't necessarily totally free of fat. It has to have less than a half a gram of fat per serving. And the same goes with the products that are labeled trans fat-free. They can still have a little bit of trans fat, which is the worst kind of fat for your health, but less than a half a gram per serving. So these all, if you are working with people or you or yourself are wanting to make a claim, know that you have to have the basis for this claim. And most food labels are going to be regulated by FDA, while meat and those sorts of products are regulated by the U.S. Department of Agriculture. Next slide. I have a few more examples because these are found on a lot of food products. It might say excellent source of, rich in, high. That means that it does contain 20% or more of the daily value, while a good source, again, these all have legal definitions, has 10 to 19% of the daily value. The daily value is the amount that we, in general, as humans, need to consume in a day. So that percent of the daily value gives an indication of how close you are to meeting your requirements. And if the word contains is on the label, like contains calcium, iron, protein, fiber, that means it has 10% or more of the daily value. The good news is there's no test on this today, but I did want to make everyone aware that you can't just put anything on a label because it sounds good. And in the work I've done with entrepreneurs, a lot of times they'll want to say these things on the label, and we have to look very closely. Next slide. Okay, now I want you to go back to the chat and I want you to tell us what you think healthy means. If you see healthy on the label, what does that mean? Any thoughts on the word healthy? Safe, low calories, nothing yet. Good for your body, low in fat, no actual meaning. Whatever the manufacturer intends it to mean, that's a good answer. Let's go on to the next slide, because I actually don't have the right answer for you, because through Halloween, October 31st of this year, they had comments open for a new rule. This would update the healthy claim definition, which was really nebulous. It was very, very vague. And we saw healthy on a lot of products that maybe we wouldn't consider to be healthy. So I guess watch and see what happens. Under the proposed definition, which you can find on the FDA.gov site, more foods that are part of a healthy diet pattern and recommended by the U.S. Dietary Guidelines. A recent one came out during the pandemic. These foods would now be eligible to use the claim on their labeling. So it's been a little controversial. There were a lot of media stories that came out about this potential new definition and how it might be used by food manufacturers. So I guess I would say on my question to you, what does it mean? We don't exactly know yet. And it's too late now to put our comments in, but you know, more to come, I guess. So stay tuned for that. Next slide. As far as the nutrition label, and Karen will talk more about food labels in a few minutes, there are specific places where things need to go on a label. So we have the information panel that can include a nutrition label if it's required. Directly under the nutrition label is an ingredient statement. We also need a name and address, and certainly we need allergens. So I'm going to ask all of you who are listening, what is the upcoming new allergen that is going to have to be on all products if they contain this particular food? Good job. Yes. Sesame is coming soon to a label near you. To the right of the principal.
Sorry.
Yep.
Sorry. Sorry.
That's okay. That's okay. So we have the information panel and we have the principal display panel, and these are pictures directly off the food labeling guide. And I have found the food labeling guide to be so helpful, because not only does it tell you where these different things need to be, but it also tells you what font size. And I do a lot of nutrition labeling for companies, and sometimes when I see the nutrition label in a size 3 font on a tiny package, they haven't followed the rules. So we do need to follow the rules for font size and location. They're definitely, these items should be in certain areas. Next slide. So a lot of people will think that we have to have a nutrition label on every product, and that isn't the case. And especially with small businesses just starting out, sometimes I try to talk them out of paying to have a nutrition label done, just because they don't have to unless they reach certain requirements. So for example, if you sell more than $50,000 a year in food, you have to have a nutrition label. If you make a claim, one of those health claims I talked about, good source, low fat, those sorts of things, or if you put an actual FDA claim, like this product is good for heart health, you know, there's a very specific wording. If you make those kinds of claims, or if the food is fortified or for baby food, If it's a retailer or buyer requirement, those would be times when you definitely have to have a nutrition label. So certainly labels are helpful for marketing, and they're very good for consumer information, and hopefully they use them to make their healthy choices, but they're not always required. And it kind of also depends on what type of food. So you don't, on a plain spice label, for example, you typically won't find a nutrition label because it's negligible in terms of any nutrients. Next slide. So again, what has to have a label? Nutrient claim. It's not required to have a nutrition label on unprocessed raw fruits. So when you go to the produce aisle and you pick up an apple, it won't have a nutrition label. However, if you buy vegetables that have been processed in some way, such as baby carrots, which have been probably cut down from larger carrots, those will carry a nutrition label because they have been processed. Whereas if you bought the carrots with the stems, of course, they won't have a nutrition label. Fish, fresh fish won't have a label, but processed fish, breaded and so on would. You won't typically find a nutrition label on coffee, tea, I mentioned spices, foods in small packages, like a pack of gum, for example, you won't typically find a nutrition label. Bulk foods, which we're seeing a lot less of post-pandemic just because of contamination risk, but you don't have a nutrition label on those. So there are many times when you don't have to have a nutrition label, and I think I've covered the main ones. So how about those allergens? Extremely important. Karen's just flipped over the slide that shows the nutrition facts typically is bordered by the ingredient statement. The ingredient statement on the second example, if the product does contain an allergen, it will be listed. So wheat, milk, eggs, soy, sesame, as you all said, that would have to be right under the ingredient statement and prefaced by contains. So the 9 main allergens, I think I've listed most of them now, but milk, eggs, wheat, soy, fish, shellfish, tree nuts, peanuts, and now sesame. These advisory statements that we're finding on so many products, where it might say, may contain, processed in a facility that also processes peanuts, or you name it, those are not required. A lot of the folks that I work with like to list them because they often use the same equipment to process another product. So, in that case, definitely is a good idea. There should be a good cleaning process in between the different potentially allergenic foods, but just know that when you see this on a product, it isn't required. Now we have a poll question, if they could release the poll for us. If you make any changes to your formula, do you need a new nutrition label and ingredient statement? Is that yes or no? I'll give you a little bit more time. All right, well, majority, you are correct. Yes, you do. If you make any changes, that could definitely affect, what calories, carbohydrates, protein, all those different nutrients. So that's time when you have to go back in and have your product reanalyzed. Just so you know that nutrition labeling can be done either as in a commercial lab, which is a lot more expensive, or using approved software. All right, next slide, and I think this is yours.
It is.
All right,
All
thank you.
right. Thank you, Julie, and have safe travels. All right. Hi, everybody. I'm Karen Blakesley. And as Julie mentioned at the start, I am with Kansas State University Research and Extension. I'm an extension associate in our food science program, and it's great to be with you today. So I'm going to continue our presentation and give you a few more details about the labeling itself. So as Julie kind of touched on what the basics are that you need to have on your products. So I want to go into a little more detail. From the start, your product identity. What is your name? What is the name of the product? And this is something that you want to catch the customer's attention. Make it something kind of eye-catching maybe. But it must appear on the principal display panel, which is what the customer sees right up front. This is your biggest marketing thing that you can put on your package. In some cases, you may have to comply to standard of identity regulations, and I'll talk about those here in a second. So you can use the common or usual name of the food, such as rice or milk or barbecue sauce or salsa, something like that. Use those common names. Those are consumer friendly names. People know them. You can give it a little extra flair, I guess you could say, with giving it an adjective to help describe it better. But those common and usual names are really kind of important so that consumers really understand what that product is in the package. So that must appear on the principal display panel right up front. Okay. So the standard of identity, just a little history behind why this regulation exists. It started back in 1939 to address adulteration problems. For example, products were being called jam when it contained just very little to no amount of fruit in it. So there are regulations, for example, for jams and jellies, as far as how much, especially in a jam, how much pieces of fruit need to be in there to be called a jam. So there are standards of identity that you need to comply with. And it's to help protect the consumers. It's to help to promote honesty and fairness, so that people are getting what they are paying for. So you can learn more about this on the FDA's website, or send us questions. We can help you with that too, as far as does your product need to comply with the standards of identity. It's not for every food, but there's quite a few that do need to comply with this. The net quantity is either weight, volume, or the number of products in a package. In general, solid type products are sold by weight, liquid products are sold by volume. And you also have to include the metric weight quantity along with the regular, what we use here in the United States for example, like if you say net weight 8 ounces, then you need to put the grams in parentheses. That is required. So this needs to be placed in the lower third of the label, right on the principal display panel. So it's right there up front. And again, on all of these on the label, there are specific requirements on the font size and how this should be displayed. The declaration of responsibility. Again, this is either you yourself, if you're manufacturing in it, or if you have a co-packer making the product for you, or a distributor, who is the person that's ultimately responsible for this product. So you have to have your name, a physical address, and your zip code, and it's usually placed right below the ingredient statement. That's where you're going to see most of them. So that is something so people can get a hold of you, and in case there's a problem or something like that. So this is something that needs to be on your package. So be upfront about that. And again, it's either you yourself if you're manufacturing, or it may be your co-packer, or if you're distributing it through another entity to get your products out. And then the ingredient listing, the ingredients that are in your product are listed by order of predominance by weight from high to low. And you should include trace amounts of ingredients. And there are, in some cases, it depends on your product. We may be able to combine ingredients under one category, such as spices, and I'll explain more about this here in a second. So if you use ingredients that have like ketchup, for example, if you're using ketchup, you also have to identify the sub ingredients. What's in that ketchup? You have to declare that. So that's a part of it. And when you start using ingredients like that, and when we have to list the sub ingredients, then your ingredient statement is going to grow. So just know that it could get rather long. So that's something to consider to how your listing is going to be displayed on your label, and how much space you have too. That's the other thing. So again, they have to be in order and predominance by weight from high to low. All right. So in the case of spices, we do have some leeway as far as maybe hiding your secrets of your formula that you might have. And in this case with spices, we can combine a lot of these and just call them spices. Even if it's just one spice, like mustard seed, for example, we can just call it spice. And, you know, obviously people will probably be able to see the mustard seed in your product if it's like pickles, for example, but we can just list it as spice. And one advantage of doing this is it can help reduce the length of your ingredient statement. Now, if you're using something like paprika or turmeric or saffron, or other spices that are also a coloring agent, those do have to be declared either by their common or usual name, or you could just call it spice and coloring. What I usually do is we'll say spices and then in parentheses say including paprika, just to be open and honest about it. So, but a lot of these, there's a lot of spices that can be grouped together and put under that heading of spices, and that can help reduce the length of your ingredient statement. So sub ingredients, as I mentioned, this is where your label can get kind of long. So if your food is made up of foods with other multiple ingredients, like I mentioned, ketchup. If you're making a barbecue sauce, for example, it's got ketchup and Worcestershire sauce in it, and liquid smoke or whatever it is, we have to know those sub ingredients of all of those ingredients, and they have to be declared. That is part of the regulations. We can't just say ketchup. We can't just say Worcestershire sauce. So, so those will be listed for, and you can see here on the flour, for example, you'll see enriched flour, and then it's got the sub ingredients of wheat flour, barley, niacin, all the vitamins that are added back in it. Those have to be declared. Same is true for leavening, like baking powder. It's not just listed as baking powder. You have to list the sub ingredients on that. So you got to be thorough. And we work with a lot of clients that make a lot of products that have already made ingredients, and you got to be accurate about the sub ingredients and get those listed properly. In some cases, if you have ketchup that you're making yourself and all of your ingredients. You've made all your ingredients yourself. You know the formulas of those ingredients. Then we can combine those sub ingredients, and we wouldn't have to say ketchup or whatever. We could combine those ingredients because we know all the quantities of that. But in most cases, like in a barbecue sauce example, we are using ketchup that's already pre-made. You're not going companies aren't going to tell you what that formula is. So that's the other reason why we have to list those sub ingredients. Lots of detail to pay attention to with this. Chemical preservatives have to be declared. For example, the three here I've listed, like sodium benzoate, benzoic acid, calcium propionate, they have to be listed. And then after that, you have to say preservative, or give it a little more detail, say to retard spoilage, or it's a mold inhibitor. You can get specific like that. We just usually say preservatives. Hopefully you can see this example here where the calcium propionate and sodium benzoate are the preservatives. So you can see it's the preservative word is listed right after those. So those do have to be declared if you're using those in your product. And if those preservatives are in one of your ingredients, that has to be declared there too as a preservative. So just be aware of that. So who can help you with creating nutrition labels if you choose to, or if you're required to? Julie, Dr. Robinson, she does labels for clients up in North Dakota and some outside of North Dakota. Here at K-State, we have a program called the Kansas Value Added Foods Lab, and we work with a lot of clients here in Kansas, but we do work with some outside of Kansas, and we can help create nutrition labels for you. It is a confidential service that we offer, so we don't share anybody's formulas with anybody. Everything is confidential, and so we use a software that we have purchased, and that's FDA compliant, and then we can take your formulas and all the information, as much detail as you can possibly give us, and then we can create your labels for you. All right. Just some references that we used for our presentation today. We have a publication here at K-State called Food Labeling for Kansas Food Producers and Processors. Of course, the the Food and Drug Administration's has lots and lots of information, and it can be a little overwhelming, and that's why we're doing these webinars, to kind of help you sift through all that overwhelming information, to help you understand it and know what you need to have done. And of course, all our information is on our North Central Food Safety Extension Network website, which you can access here, or just by doing a Google search for NCFSEN. So with that, I think I'm at the end of their presentation. So it looks like we've got a little, if I'm looking at clock right here, we've got a little time to answer any questions we might have. I see one about pumpkin spice. Or pumpkin pie. Yeah, so it depends on the spices that you're using. So if it's like cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, things like that, those can be grouped together and called spice. So yeah, that's a good example. So is that only for spice or coloring? Yeah, so not sure what that question is referencing to.
You were talking about adding color to spices.
Oh, well, if you're using like saffron, turmeric, paprika, those are also identified as a coloring. So those have to be identified specifically. I think the organic question got answered. Let's see here. Yeah, you know, our poll question about the changes, it is up to you. If you change anything in your formula or the size of your package or whatever, it is up to you. It's your responsibility to make sure that your product is matching what you're putting into the package. So it is on you to, so if you do need nutrition label changes, then that's on you to reach out and get that help to get your nutrition label updated. Because if you change your formula, it'll likely change the nutritional value that's on your current labels. So you do need to keep that up to date. Natural identical flavors. Nature identical flavors. Do they have to be listed? Well, if it's any kind of a flavoring, you do have to, if it's a natural flavoring. So if it's something like, for example, if you're infusing spices into a liquid of some sort, and you make a bag of spices and you infuse that into the liquid and then you pull those spices out. You can just call that a natural flavoring, okay? You don't have to list the spices for that. You could just call it a natural flavoring. I hope that answers your question on that. The consequences of not having the right font size. Well, the FDA does randomly go around and get samples of products. They'll go around to stores and purchase products and check into those. And if they find that your label's not compliant, they will contact you. And don't be afraid of that. They're there to help you because they want you to have the correct information on there. So try to work with label suppliers that are in this business and they know the regulations on what the font size should be, especially for like your principal display panel, your net weight and all that kind of stuff. So make sure that you've got a good label supplier to help you out with that. Allergens on a coffee label, you know, if you're renting a facility, again, the may contain, I think we touched on that. Putting that on there is voluntary. If you want to say may contain peanuts, for example, because that's an allergen, that's voluntary. It's not required. So so that's up to you if you do want to put that on there. I'm scrolling back through here. I think those were the main ones. Any other questions? Any other comments?
Let's see.
Let's see, let me
So
go down.
we keep getting one about organic certification. I would highly suggest that person reach out to their extension specialist in their state and sit down and have a thorough conversation about your coffee grinds and whether they could be determined as organic. The next question is, how do you determine shelf life? And then listed on the label. I'll let you get started, Karen, and I'll wrap it up if I need to.
Yeah, so shelf life is a process, process that we do. It includes doing microbial testing on your products. We can do it a couple ways. We have the ability to do accelerated shelf life testing. And so at certain points of time, you know, we'll keep your product in the accelerator for like a month, for example. And then at regular points in time, we will take samples and see if there's any microbial changes, any microbial growth. And also check the sensory properties of it too, because you want to know if it still tastes good. You want to know if there's any color changes or odor changes, and you know the smell of the product, just the overall quality of it. so that's something that we can help with to determine that. You know, in most cases, we can kind of generalize because a lot of these products typically have a year shelf life. You know, commercially made canned foods typically have a year or even 2-year shelf life on them. So Shannon, you can fill in any of the blanks I might have missed here.
And sometimes it's not as easy as you have this product, this should be the shelf life. So you may need to get your product actually tested.
Mm-hmm.
And so with a lot of the companies we work with here in our state, we go through the process of doing different form of shelf life analysis. And so it's not so much that people can say, I have this product, what's the shelf life of it? It depends on your ingredients. So if you don't have certain preservatives or anything else in it, then we would actually have to do the actual analysis to determine the shelf life of your product.
And I also see a question in the Q&A about if you have a product you're wanting to get in the store, how do you go about doing this? This is where we can help. Contact your extension specialist. You know, one of us, Shannon, can help with your products in Iowa State. Karen Fifield, she's our colleague at Michigan State. All of us can help with this and help you get started on getting your product into a grocery store and see what needs to be done. It's all going to depend on what your product is and what needs to be done. And if you have to have a process authority letter or not, that's the other side of this too.
And then I'm putting the link to the MultiGroup state site in the chat. And so that is usually a place to get started. I know for you can start there. I know on here we have list of food preservation resources, but also the food safety best practices for local food entrepreneurs that also has a list of different resources that are out there for each state. But Karen and my contact information were on the flyers that was sent out to you all. And we will be more in constant contact with you. If you contact us, we can get you directed to the right person.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and just remember, every state's a little different, you know, as far as what regulations we need to follow. So, you know, we here in Kansas, we do work with some people outside of Kansas, but again, you need to also follow what your state requires too. So there's a lot to this. It's not a simple process to get the food on the shelf, but we're glad to help if we can. Let's see, what's this?
Anna, I think you're here in Iowa, so you should be in contact with me. And I think you also got an email yesterday.
That's good. Preservatives and listing them on the label. So if you're using any kind of preservative, you know, like I listed those, like the sodium benzoate, for example, calcium propionate, those have to be listed. It's a chemical preservative, so those do have to be declared. And it's part of the FDA regulations, and it's being honest about what you're putting in your product. So. All right. Approximate cost to have a nutrition analysis done for labels. So here in Kansas, if you're a Kansas producer, we charge $100 to do a label. If you're out of state, it's $200. So that's what we charge here in Kansas. I'm not sure what others charge exactly. And I will say we do get funding from our Kansas Department of Agriculture, so that helps us reduce our costs and prices to you. If you go to a commercial business, and there's a lot of commercial businesses that will do this for you, it costs a lot more, but so just know that. We can help, ease the cost a little bit.
I think it's Suzita D.S. Dawson. You're the person that has been talking back and forth with you in the chat is your contact for Missouri, Dr. Londa Nowicki. So I will put her email in one of the responses to you. So I think that's why she kept jumping and answering your questions. She might have recognized your name, but that is your point of contact for Missouri.
Okay, any other questions, comments? Shannon, did you see that question from Anna in the chat?
So Anna, just contact me. I'm gonna send my email to you. Last questions.
Right type of container to package your product in. So yeah, that's a great question. It kind of depends on your product. It's going to depend on if how you're going to process it, and whether it's going to withstand the heating process that you need to do. Some can be done by hot fill. Some of them can be run through like a water bath canning system. So there's lots of different kinds of packaging out there, plastics, glass. It kind of depends on what your vision is to start with too. What you intend the customer, how they want to use it. So think through that. But we can, I think Karen Fifield, I think you're probably a little more in tune to the packaging side of things. But
yes,
yes,
it definitely has to be labeled that it's food safe.
yes,
It doesn't have to be, anything like, it shouldn't be anything like a garbage bag or something identified to use for other things, because they do have chemicals and things added. But of course, are going to want to make sure that it's not just attractive, but definitely has to be labeled that it's food safe to be served or use any product in it.
mm-hmm.
Making sure there's no lead-based paints or things like that. So definitely read your packaging description before you actually order it, because you're going to want it. Otherwise, it would just ruin absolutely everything you have. So, but every state is different on most all of these things, except probably that one item that it does have to be food safe for packaging.
As far as compostable pouch bags, do we have to explain how to compost? I'm thinking that as long as you can say this is recyclable on the package, I think that's, unless I'm missing something.
I think you're right, Karen. And that was the kind of thing I was going to allude to a little bit, that it doesn't have to be recyclable, but if that's what you want, that's how you would have to, identify that. Because not everybody that would be purchasing it may not have a recyclable system or anything like that. However, you still want to make sure that it's definitely a food safe container.
Mm-hmm.
They're generally,
Yeah, I'm sorry, go ahead.
that's all right. They're generally just one single use containers is what they are.
Right.
Made just for that identifying product.
Right. If proper storage done by the customer after the product is unpacked is good, how to ensure? Well, that's customer responsibility, you know, after they've opened the product. I believe that's what you're asking about. And also, if your product, once it's opened, if it needs refrigeration, you need to state that on your product, on the label, and it says refrigerate after opening. Simple as that. Good. That's just good practice, and that way it helps ensure that your product will be safer for the customer to be using. So if it is something that requires refrigeration after opening, that should be stated on the label. Lots of great questions today. Well, I'm not seeing anything else right now. So Shannon, do you have any closing comments?
No, just thank you everyone for joining us for the series. We'll be checking attendance, and those who have completed all 3 webinars will receive a certificate of completion. We also are working on getting the recordings be put up on a platform where it's captioned for later use. Please make sure that you go and utilize the supplemental fact sheets that also come with the webinar. Anything from you, Karen?
I'm good.
Fifield, or Karen Fifield
Oh,
too?
sorry.
Nope, you guys covered it all. And thank you all for participating.
Michelle, you will hear if you get a certificate. You can also email me and I'll let you know, but I need to do the full attendance.